makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Kathy, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the April 19th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A standoff at the Strait. Iran takes back control. Demands U.S. end its naval blockade as hopes dim for quick end to war. By Aaron Boxerman and Ewan Ward. Jerusalem. Iran said on Saturday that it had reimposed strict control of the Strait of Hormuz until the United States ended its own naval blockade, just hours after both countries announced the waterway had reopened. The new developments added to the confusion over the status of transit through the strait and could dampen hopes for a quick end to the war. A shipping monitor run by the British Navy said on Saturday that it had received a report of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps firing at a tanker in the strait. The captain reported the ship's crew was safe. Just a day earlier, Iran's foreign minister called the strait completely open, leading President Trump to declare a major breakthrough in the negotiations between the two countries on a permanent ceasefire. At the same time, Mr. Trump said the United States would maintain its blockade of ships traveling from Iranian ports. His statement appeared to anger the Iranians, who had expected the United States to reciprocate by ending its blockade. Mr. Trump imposed the blockade on Monday after the countries failed to reach any agreement after a marathon bargaining session in Pakistan last weekend. The two countries are currently abiding by a ceasefire set to expire on Tuesday. Iran has choked global energy supplies by menacing passing ships during more than a month of war with the United States and Israel. The throttling of oil tanker traffic has sent oil prices soaring, and they dropped after Iran's announcement on Friday that the strait was reopened. Mr. Trump on Saturday continued to project optimism about the prospect of a deal, despite Iran's closure of the strait again. They got a little cute, as they have been doing for 47 years, he told reporters in the Oval Office after signing an executive order on an unrelated matter. The peace talks, he maintained, were going actually along very well, and we'll see. Hopes for an end to the war were also boosted by the 10-day ceasefire in Lebanon that went into effect on Friday. The ceasefire appeared to hold on Saturday, though Israel's military said it continued to strike what it said were militants who approached Israeli military lines, saying they were in violation of the truce. Israel has also continued to occupy parts of southern Lebanon and demolish buildings close to the border, in villages where it says that Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militant group, has historically entrenched itself. Elsewhere in southern Lebanon, a United Nations peacekeeper was killed and 3 others were injured on Saturday after a patrol came under attack from non-state actors. The peacekeeping force, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, known as UNIFIL, said in a statement. President Emmanuel Macron of France identified the dead peacekeeper as Florian Montorio, a French national, and suggested in a statement that Hezbollah was responsible. President Joseph Aoun of Lebanon condemned the latest attack and attributed it to unidentified gunmen during a call with Mr. Macron on Saturday, according to a statement. Hezbollah denied any involvement. There has been a string of attacks against UNIFIL during the war. 3 UN peacekeepers were killed last month, including one by Israeli tank fire, according to a preliminary UN investigation. The turnabout in the Strait of Hormuz followed a day in which Mr. Trump seemingly conducted negotiations via the news media and social media. In a burst of dizzying messages and interviews, he said that the U.S. blockade of Iranian ship traffic would continue, but also that he expected a deal in the next day or two, and that Iran had agreed to everything. Mr. Trump said that Iran had agreed to suspend its nuclear program indefinitely, that it would let the United States retrieve its nuclear material, and that it would not receive any frozen assets from the United States. The president has often made overly optimistic claims about the war, which began in late February. No new face-to-face talks were announced as of Saturday morning, and Iran's top negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, quickly denied that Iran had agreed to any of its adversaries' core demands. Iran had demanded that Israel halt its fight against Hezbollah as a condition of reaching a broader peace deal. Mr. Trump and U.S. officials worked to make that happen, even as they denied they were trying to meet Iran's conditions. On Saturday, thousands of displaced Lebanese returned to the country's devastated south for the second day in a row. The country's coastal highway was clogged with miles of bumper-to-bumper traffic as cars piled high with mattresses and personal belongings moved at a snail's pace. Some people flashed peace signs from their car windows. Others paused to stretch their legs. I didn't ask anyone to check on my house or send me pictures. I want to do that myself, said Zachary Zakaria, 55, who stopped on Saturday to buy essentials as his family headed home to the southern town of Kfar Tebnit, which was heavily bombarded during the war. We are heading there not knowing what we will find, or what we might not, he said. People arriving back at their hometowns often found a wasteland. Twisted hulls of burned-out cars sat along roads next to stores and apartments that had been leveled. Villagers out on the streets were sweeping up shards of glass, repairing downed electricity lines, and using fire hoses to clean debris off the pavement. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel said last week that Israeli forces would remain in what he called a security strip, stretching more than 6 miles into Lebanese territory. That will prevent many of the more than 1 million people displaced by the fighting from returning to their homes, prolonging a humanitarian crisis and potentially destabilizing the truce. Hezbollah has demanded that Israeli forces withdraw and had warned that it was keeping its finger on the trigger. The Israeli strikes on Saturday added to confusion over the scope of Israel's military operations under the ceasefire deal. Under its terms, Israel will preserve its right to take all necessary measures in self-defense at any time against planned, imminent, or ongoing attacks, according to the State Department. But it will not carry out offensive military operations, the agreement says. The Shadow Papers. Secret memos obtained by the New York Times illuminate the origins of the Supreme Court's shadow docket rulings on presidential power, by Jody Cantor and Adam Liptak. Just after 6 p.m. on a February evening in 2016, the Supreme Court issued a cryptic one-paragraph ruling that sent both climate policy and the court itself spinning in a new direction. For 2 centuries, the court had generally handled major cases at a steady pace that encouraged care and deliberation, relying on written briefs, oral arguments, and in-person discussions. The justices composed detailed opinions that explained their thinking to the public and rendered judgment only after other courts had weighed in. But this time, the justices were sprinting to block a major presidential initiative. By a 5-4 vote along partisan lines, the order halted President Barack Obama's Clean Power Plan, his signature environmental policy. They acted before any other court had addressed the plan's lawfulness. The decision consisted of only legal boilerplate, without a word of reasoning. At the time, the ruling seemed like a curious one-off, but that single paragraph turned out to be a sharp and lasting break. That night marks the birth, many legal experts believe, of the court's modern shadow docket, the secretive track that the Supreme Court has since used to make many major decisions, including granting President Trump more than 20 key victories on issues from immigration to agency power. Since that night a decade ago, the logic behind the Supreme Court's pivotal 2016 order has remained a mystery. Why did a majority of the justices bypass time-tested procedures and opt for a new way of doing business? The answer would remain secret for generations, legal experts predicted. We'll never know, at least until our grandkids can read the justices' internal papers from that time period. Stephen Vladeck, a law professor at Georgetown, wrote in a newsletter in February marking the anniversary of the order. The New York Times has obtained those papers and is now publishing them, bringing the origins of the Supreme Court's shadow docket into the light. The papers are online at nytimes.com. The 16 pages of memos, exchanged in a 5-day dash, provide an extraordinarily rare window into the court, showing how the justices talked to one another outside of public view. Writing on formal letterhead, but addressing one another by their first names and signing off with their initials, they sound notes of irritation, air grievances, and plead for more time. In addition to the usual legal materials, they cite a blog post and twice a television interview. They sometimes engage with one another's arguments, but they often simply talk past each other. In public, Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr. has cultivated a reputation for care and caution. The papers reveal a different side of him. At a critical moment for the country and the court, the papers show he acted as a bulldozer in pushing to stop Mr. Obama's plan to address the global climate crisis. When colleagues warned the Chief Justice that he was proposing an unprecedented move, he was dismissive. I recognize that the posture of this stay request is not typical, he wrote. But he argued that the Obama plan, which aimed to regulate coal-fired plants, was the most expensive regulation ever imposed on the power sector, and too big, costly, and consequential for the court not to act immediately. In the Trump era, he and the other conservative justices have repeatedly empowered the president through their shadow docket rulings. By contrast, the papers reveal a court wielding those same powers to block Mr. Obama. Justice Samuel A. Alito, Jr. warned that if the court failed to stop the president, its own institutional legitimacy would be threatened. The court's liberals pushed back, but compared with their recent slashing dissents, they were not especially forceful, mostly confining their arguments to procedures and timing. The papers expose what critics have called the weakness at the heart of the shadow docket, an absence of the kind of rigorous debate that the justices devote to their normal cases. After obtaining the papers, the Times confirmed their authenticity with several people familiar with the deliberations and shared them with a spokeswoman for the court. The Times posed detailed questions to the justices who wrote the memos. They did not respond. Since that breakneck February 2016 exchange, the emergency docket has swelled into a major part of the court's business, as the justices have short-circuited the deliberations of lower courts. The decisions are technically temporary, but are often hugely consequential. Rulings with no explanation or reasoning, like the sparse paragraph from that February night, have become routine. The emergency docket is now a central legacy of the court led by Chief Justice Roberts. Read a decade later, the memos suggest that none of the justices fully appreciated what they were doing, embarking on a questionable new way of operating. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The 2016 case was a collision between the principles and personalities of Mr. Obama and Chief Justice Roberts. The president was under enormous pressure to address the global climate crisis. He had campaigned on that promise. Then for 8 years as the planet heated, he failed to get major environmental legislation through Congress. With his term about to end, this was his last chance to act. The Chief Justice was eager to assert his institution's authority to rein it in. Mr. Obama's Environmental Protection Agency, he believed, had sidestepped a recent ruling. The two men, both cerebral, polished Harvard Law graduates, had long posed a puzzle. How could such smooth personalities create so much friction? Mr. Obama had been one of just 22 senators to vote against Chief Justice Roberts' confirmation in 2005, saying that the nominee had far more often used his formidable skills on behalf of the strong in opposition to the weak. 4 years later, the two men managed to botch the simple task of reciting the presidential oath at Mr. Obama's first inauguration. True, Chief Justice Roberts had cast the decisive vote in 2012 to save the centerpiece of the Affordable Care Act, Mr. Obama's signature legislative achievement, but that was approved by Congress. After Republicans won control of Congress, Mr. Obama responded by pushing the boundaries of presidential authority, promising that his administration would act on pressing problems with or without Congress. He tightened gun regulations and granted deportation relief to millions of undocumented immigrants. The Chief Justice and some of his colleagues were watching warily, concerned the president was going past what the Constitution allowed him to do on his own. In a 2014 opinion written by Justice Antonin Scalia, the court warned Mr. Obama that he needed to tread carefully in setting environmental policy without congressional approval. The statement was one of the early articulations of what would come to be known as the Major Questions Doctrine, saying that on important matters, executive branch agencies could act only with clear directions from Congress. Then, in June 2015, the court ruled against the Obama administration in a case involving mercury emissions. The next day, an EPA official, Janet McCabe, made what now looks like a tactical error. She issued a statement that, according to the papers, offended the Chief Justice and struck him as an attempt to sideline the court. She asserted that the court's ruling had come too late to matter, already in compliance or well on their way to compliance, Ms. McCabe wrote on the agency's website. In a recent interview, Ms. McCabe said she had not meant to be disrespectful of the Supreme Court or the judicial system and was merely stating a legal reality. Indeed, over more than 3 years of litigation, no court had stayed the mercury regulation and power plants had already taken major steps to conform. With the clock ticking down on Mr. Obama's presidency and the global Paris Climate Accords looming, the White House tried to craft a signature piece of environmental legislation that could survive the court's scrutiny. In October 2015, the EPA issued Mr. Obama's Clean Power Act plan, which aimed to shift the power sector from reliance on coal to natural gas, wind, and solar. The goal was an aggressive transformation in the domestic energy industry, according to a White House fact sheet. Its legal basis was open to question. The agency said it was authorized by a seldom-used provision of an old law, the Clean Air Act of 1970. Critics responded that it was unlikely that Congress would have authorized a sweeping overhaul of the nation's power supply in such an obscure provision. When more than 24 states, along with business groups, quickly sued to stop the program, Obama administration lawyers readied for an extended fight, they said in recent interviews. The case was surely going to wind its way to the Supreme Court eventually, and given the tension between the conservative justices and the Obama administration, they knew it might not survive. The challenge to the regulation went straight to the D.C. Circuit, which set it down for a prompt argument, but refused to halt the plan in the meantime. At that point, the challengers, led by West Virginia, tried to take a shortcut. Instead of waiting for the appeals court to hear a case, they went straight to the Supreme Court, asking the justices to pause the plan for the duration of the litigation, including an eventual possible return trip to the Supreme Court. Both sides agreed it was an unusual request. This had never been done, Albert Lynn, who was West Virginia's Solicitor General, acknowledged in an interview. At the Justice Department, lawyers involved with the case said they were not terribly worried. To be sure, the court sometimes granted emergency applications from death row inmates and in fast-moving election disputes. But the court had never intervened on an emergency basis to shut down a major presidential initiative. In football practice, said Avi S. Garbo, the West Virginia's emergency request landed with Chief Justice In football practice, said Avi S. Garbo, the EPA's general counsel at the time, we would call it a Hail Mary. West Virginia's emergency request landed with Chief Justice Roberts on January 26, 2016, just as the Supreme Court was scattering into vacation mode for an annual midwinter break. Justice Clarence Thomas retreated to Florida to teach a law school class. Justice Stephen G. Breyer delivered a lecture in Paris. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave a talk in Italy billed as a conversation with the notorious RBG. Justice Antonin Scalia sped through Asia, where he promoted a book, met with the Prime Minister of Singapore, and schmoozed with local lawyers over drinks at a rooftop bar. In the meantime, Chief Justice Roberts worked speedily, ordering the Obama administration to respond in just 8 days. To better understand what happened next, the Times spoke to 10 people, liberals and conservatives, who were familiar with the deliberations over the pivotal emergency order and who spoke on the condition of anonymity because confidentiality was a condition of their employment. At the court, word was passing among the clerks, who serve as brokers among the 9 chambers. Some of the conservative justices were taking the long-shot applications seriously. It was initially hard to tell how the vote would fall, people familiar with the discussions said. The Supreme Court felt less predictable back then, more alive with debate. The court was technically divided 5-4 justices between appointed by Republicans and Democrats, but Justice Kennedy, appointed by President Ronald Reagan, was a true swing vote, a persuadable person, as one of those people put it. The term before, he had written the majority opinion to establish a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. On February 5th, the internal correspondence obtained by the Times shows the Chief Justice circulated a blast of a memo insisting that the court halt the president's plan. His arguments were forceful, quick, and filled with confident predictions. The court was going to give the case a full hearing eventually, he forecast. At that point, the justices would vote to overturn the Obama plan, he said, because it went beyond the boundaries of the Clean Air Act. For now, the Chief Justice contended that the court had to act immediately because the energy industry must make changes to business plans today. Absent a stay, the Clean Power Plan will cause, and is causing, substantial and irreversible reordering of the domestic power sector before this court has an opportunity to review its legality, he wrote. In his final paragraph, the Chief Justice again told colleagues that the EPA had done an end run around the court with the mercury regulation just months before, and said the agency had signaled that it was planning to do the same thing again. The Chief Justice cited an unusual source for the last point, one that would not ordinarily figure in a Supreme Court opinion. An interview with the BBC in which the EPA administrator at the time, Gina McCarthy, had said, "We are baking the Clean Power Plan into the system." The comments of the EPA administrator herself indicate that without immediate action from this court, this rule will become functionally irreversible, he wrote. In the memo, he weighed no potential downsides of his proposal and considered no alternatives. Justice Breyer responded later that day to the chief's memo, but did not address all its points. Such stays were unusual, he wrote, stating his objections mildly. He skipped over the question of whether the plan was lawful, asking only, why the rush? The circuit court had already set a date to hear the case in June. The first deadline for power plants to reduce their emissions was 6 years away. Full compliance was not required until 2030. That was plenty of time for the case to play out through the legal system. The chief wrote back the next day, sounding irritated and blunt. Speed was vital, he said, because environmental regulation was going to be very expensive for states and the power industry. The sums involved could approach $480 billion, he asserted, and industry groups would have to start preparations immediately. Without a stay of the EPA's rule, both the states and private industry will suffer irreparable harm from a rule that is, in my view, highly unlikely to survive, he wrote. He was predicting the ultimate outcome of a case that had barely begun to be litigated. Seeing how little headway Justice Breyer had made, Justice Elena Kagan sounded an alarm. In a memo on February 7th, she warned the Chief Justice that he was departing from the court's long-established way of doing business. The unique nature of the relief sought in those applications gives me real pause, she wrote. Court action at this point in the process would be unprecedented, she added. She mentioned that she was inclined to find that the Obama plan was lawful, but she said that the thin briefing made it difficult for her to determine with any confidence which side is ultimately likely to prevail. Justice Alito issued a salvo on the same day as Justice Kagan, with neither of them addressing the either. Echoing the Chief Justice's sense of insult and suspicion about the Obama administration, he wrote that the EPA appeared to be trying to render the court irrelevant. A failure to stay this rule threatens to render our ability to provide meaningful judicial review, and by extension, our institutional legitimacy, a nullity, Justice Alito wrote. The Chief Justice and Justices Scalia, Thomas, and Alito wanted to halt the Obama plan, according to people familiar with the deliberations. Justices Breyer, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan were opposed. It is not clear whether Justices Scalia, Thomas, or Ginsburg set out their reasons in writing. As usual, the decision would come down to Justice Kennedy. On February 9th, he dashed off a quick three-sentence note. He believed that the Supreme Court would ultimately stay the Clean Power Plan soon anyway, and that there was no reason to put off the inevitable. He was voting with the Chief Justice. Over just 5 days, the justices has decided the issue. Even as they debated the Obama plan's possible burden on the power industry, in the entire chain of correspondence obtained by the Times, not a single justice, conservative or liberal, mentioned the dangers of a warming planet as one of the possible harms the court should consider. At 6:20 p.m. on Tuesday, February 9th, the court alerted the public to its decision, releasing the cryptic one-paragraph order. To the public, the White House tried to downplay the speed and starkness of its loss, calling it merely a bump in the road on a call with reporters. But behind closed doors, officials were astonished that the court had intervened so quickly, they said later. Mr. Garbo, the EPA's general counsel, was meeting with Ms. McCarthy about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, when the order landed. An aide interrupted, handing him a note that he said he read with utter shock and surprise. These days, justices who disagree with emergency orders often protest in vigorous written dissents. In 2016, the 4 liberal justices merely noted they had voted against the order. Although their private memos included extended arguments against the majority's approach, they said nothing more in public. In the moment, the case looked like an outlier, not a turn toward a new way of operating, according to people involved. Nor did it look like a final decision on climate policy. Hillary Clinton was the strong favorite to win the presidency later that year. With her election, the court would be poised to take a step to the left. Then, just 4 days after the court's decision, many of the certainties, projections, and assumptions that the justices had made in those rushed memos started to collapse. The following Saturday morning, Justice Scalia failed to appear for breakfast at a weekend hunting retreat in Texas. Hours later, he was found dead. As far as the public record reveals, the vote on the Clean Power Plan was his last. Had the court not acted with exceptional speed, the case would have ended in a deadlock and the Obama plan would have stayed in place. But not for long. With Mr. Trump's election that November, the plan was doomed as a practical matter. In the end, the legacy of those 5 days was more about the transformation of the court than it was about the fate of the Obama effort to confront climate change. The litigation continued but became a ghost ship of a case after Mr. Trump replaced it with his own regulation. In 2022, this time following normal procedure, the Supreme Court concluded that the Clean Air Act did not authorize the EPA to issue sweeping regulations across the power sector to address climate change. Since then, even as the court's approval ratings dropped, applications like the one it confronted a decade ago have proliferated, swamping the court's ordinary work. This is partly a consequence of a gridlocked Congress and presidents willing to push the boundaries of executive power, particularly Mr. Trump. But it is also the result of the justice's decision to entertain emergency requests like the one in 2016, warping procedures that had developed over centuries. In an appearance this month at the University of Alabama, Justice Sonia Sotomayor reflected on the unceasing flood of emergency applications. "We've done it to ourselves," she said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump has a go-to justification for his contentious decisions: national security, by Maxine Jazalow and Devlin Barrett, Washington. President Trump offered a surprising justification in March for forging ahead with construction of his White House ballroom. Halting the $400 million project would pose a grave threat to national security. "Everything is drone-proof and bulletproof," Mr. Trump said, listing the security features of a bunker being built beneath the ballroom to protect the president in the event of an emergency. It was hardly the first time the administration had invoked national security to justify a contentious decision. Over the past year, top officials have cited similar concerns when stripping union rights from thousands of federal workers, pausing the construction of wind farms off the East Coast, and exempting oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico from protections for endangered species of whales. Critics see a troubling trend that is testing the limits of presidential power. "When you look under the hood, they're fake national security emergencies," said Patrick Parenteau, an emeritus professor at the Vermont Law and Graduate School. "This is a power grab. This is his way of circumventing Congress." Federal judges, including those appointed by Mr. Trump, have often rebuked the Justice Department over its claims of potential national security risks, though an appeals court signaled last weekend that such assertions about White House construction might be valid. It's hard to be concerned about the credibility of the United States in court when making representations about national security matters, said Andrew Mergen, a professor at Harvard Law School who spent more than 3 decades at the Justice Department. Taylor Rogers, a White House spokeswoman, said the administration was right to prioritize national security considerations across the government. It is a top priority and critical responsibility of the Commander-in-Chief to ensure the United States is not jeopardized by any potential national security threat, Ms. Rogers said in an email. When Mr. Trump unveiled his plan in July to replace the East Wing of the White House with a ballroom, he shared his desire for a much larger space that could hold hundreds of attendees for state dinners, galas, and other events. At 90,000 square feet, officials said the new structure would cost about $200 million. Since then, the price tag has more than doubled, and the stated purpose of the renovation has shifted significantly, focusing more on a bunker being built underground than the event space above. After preservationists sued in December to try to stop the construction, the administration increasingly argued that the work must continue because of essential security facilities being built beneath the ballroom, including a giant bunker complex. It is highly unusual to disclose details of such facilities. Last month, Judge Richard J. Leon, a federal district court in Washington, rejected those arguments and ordered construction stopped. In an opinion punctuated by 19 exclamation points, he wrote that Mr. Trump likely lacked the authority to replace entire sections of the White House without approval from Congress. Judge Leon, an appointee of President George W. Bush, added that he took seriously the government's concerns about safety on the White House grounds. But, he wrote, the existence of a large hole beside the White House is, of course, a problem of the president's own making. Bald assertions of national security cannot excuse the government's failure to follow the law and then insulate those failures from judicial review. Last weekend, however, a federal appeals court panel temporarily sided with the administration. By a 2-to-1 vote, the panel allowed the ballroom construction to continue until Friday and sent the case back to Judge Leon to take a closer look at the national security claims. In court filings this past week, the administration continued to spar with the group suing over the project, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The project includes national security and military installations that cannot serve their functions without an appropriate structure to shield and protect them, Justice Department lawyers argued. They added that the court is not positioned to second-guess these determinations about what is needed to ensure presidential security, let alone to superintend the construction process. The preservationists fired back. No matter how much the defendants insist otherwise, they wrote, the lack of a massive ballroom on the White House grounds is not a national security emergency. The Trump administration has also pointed to national security risks when blocking offshore wind turbines, a source of clean energy that the president has disdained for decades. Days before Christmas, the Interior Department abruptly ordered all work to halt on 5 wind farms in the Atlantic Ocean. To justify the sweeping move, officials said the Defense Department had produced a classified report that found that the projects threatened national security. The developers of the wind farms in several states sued, and federal judges handed the administration a series of losses. Several judges said they were unpersuaded by the government's national security claims after reviewing the classified report, which has not been made public. The administration recently missed a deadline to appeal those losses. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum has continued to insist, however, that wind farms can interfere with military radar, making drone attacks more difficult to detect. They create tremendous radar interference that could represent a tremendous threat, particularly off our highly populated northeast coast, Mr. Burgum told Fox Business in early February. Kirk Lippold, a military analyst who served as commander of the USS Cole when it was attacked by Al-Qaeda suicide bombers in 2000, called these arguments silly and specious. He said the military had extensively studied the potential for wind farms to disrupt radar and found that the risk was real but can be offset with planning and technological upgrades. If we have a drone attack taking out our wind farms that close to the coast of the United States, we've had a major intelligence failure that goes way beyond 9/11, Mr. Lippold said. We've got bigger problems on our hands at that point. Ms. Rogers, the White House spokeswoman, defended the administration's efforts to stifle the country's nascent offshore wind industry. The Trump administration has paused the construction of all large-scale offshore wind projects because our number one priority is to put America first and protect the national security of the American people, she said. At times, Mr. Trump has argued that the noise and vibrations from offshore wind turbines can disturb and even kill whales, though marine biologists have said there is no evidence to support such claims. The windmills are driving the whales crazy, the president declared in January 2025, weeks before pausing federal approvals for new wind farms. Yet the administration has also invoked national security concerns to remove legal protections for whales. Last month, a panel of Trump administration officials voted unanimously to exempt oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico from measures to protect endangered whales and other imperiled species. The panel, which is often called the God Squad because it essentially holds the power to decide whether a species lives or dies, adopted the move during a brief closed-door meeting. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said at the meeting that waiving the restrictions would bolster national security by increasing domestic oil production. To be as secure as a nation, we need a steady, affordable supply of our own energy, he said. Conservation groups have sued to try to overturn the move. Seth M. Barsky, a partner at the law firm Bracewell, said it was difficult to predict the outcome of the litigation because no previous administration had ever invoked national security to override a landmark environmental law, the Endangered Species Act. We're in uncharted territory, he said. The president has invoked national security concerns to try to make sweeping changes to the federal workforce. Last year, Mr. Trump signed an executive order removing collective bargaining rights from hundreds of thousands of federal employees, citing a provision of a 1978 law that gives the president authority to exclude certain agencies or divisions if there is primary function intelligence, counterintelligence, investigative, or national security work. Mr. Trump added that new claim to more than a dozen agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Coast Guard, Federal Emergency Management Agency, General Services Administration, the Departments of Health and Human Services, Agriculture and Veterans Affairs, and parts of Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Citizenship and Immigration Services. The move has spurred a host of lawsuits from the affected unions, which have argued that a designation meant to apply to intelligence officers is now being applied to janitors in federal buildings. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Texas restaurants are forcing a reckoning over immigrant labor by Jesus Jimenez, Dallas. On a recent Friday afternoon at Revolver Taco Lounge in Dallas, business was slow. Many seats at the restaurant were empty, and only a few customers were waiting for their orders. An art festival down the street was not generating much foot traffic. For Regino Roja, the owner, the day was not an anomaly, but almost a new norm. "I think this right now is worse than the pandemic," he said. About 50% of Texas restaurants reported they were not profitable last year, up from 38% in 2024, according to the Texas Restaurant Association. Some of that has been a consequence of the Trump administration's crackdown on immigration. In Texas, where by some estimates nearly 10% of the workforce is undocumented, compared with about 4.5% of the U.S. workforce, restaurant owners have said that the crackdown has created a chilling effect among their workers, regardless of their immigration status. Now, as they feel the strain, the Texas Restaurant Association and business leaders across the country have started a coalition called Seat the Table, demanding that Congress and the White House create work permits for long-term, law-abiding immigrants playing critical roles from farms to restaurants. Across the country, roughly 42% of restaurant operators said they were not profitable last year, according to the National Restaurant Association, a slight uptick from 2024, as food and labor costs have steadily increased for years. In backing the coalition, the Texas Restaurant Association, in a state with strong conservative roots, made clear that it was not calling for amnesty, nor was it asking for a pathway to citizenship for immigrants. "I think the vast majority of Americans recognize that there is a large group of undocumented immigrants who have been literally keeping food on our tables," said Kelsey Erickson Sturfert, the Chief Public Affairs Officer for the Texas Trade Group. And if we remove these people, it is going to hurt everyone in terms of higher prices. Most cities in Texas have not seen the high-profile immigration raids that have targeted Chicago, Illinois, and Minnesota over the past year. But immigration arrest data shows that federal agents have made more arrests in the Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio areas since 2025 than in Los Angeles, which experienced several high-profile raids last year. Adam Orman, who owns the restaurants Locadoro and Bambino in Austin, said some immigrants in the area feared coming to work because of anxiety around arrests. "Do I think that work permits would help? Yes," Mr. Orman said. "But we also need to change the enforcement tactics so that people aren't afraid to go to work. People aren't afraid to go spend money." Mr. Roja said he was uncertain whether a program that offered work permits would help him as a small business owner. "That's for big companies," he said. "The small and medium-sized businesses will be at the end of the line, and we're the ones who work the hardest." The strain on the labor has extended to Texas's agriculture industry. Sam Lash, a co-founder of Farm to Table, a wholesale company based in Texas that connects local farmers with chefs, said farms across the state were struggling to find workers. There's been a really symbiotic relationship between Texas farmers, Texas restaurant owners, and immigrant labor for many generations, Mr. Lash said. I've been doing this for 18 years. There has never been a time where it is more difficult to access consistent, reliable, skilled labor from immigrants. Texas is among states that lead the nation in agricultural production, along with California, Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota. With more than 200,000 farms, Texas makes up more than 14% of farmland in the United States, according to the state agricultural department. Ann E. McBride, Vice President of Impact at the James Beard Foundation, which has also joined the Seat the Table Coalition, said it was important to partner with business leaders in Texas to show lawmakers that calls for work permits were coming from across the country. Business leaders in Nebraska and Utah have also backed the coalition. This cannot be something that only takes place in blue states or in blue cities, because it will fail, she said. Despite many efforts over the decades, immigration reform has been difficult to pass through Congress. But there have been some newly promising signs for bipartisan legislation on work permits for immigrants. One proposed measure introduced last year, the so-called Dignity Act, calls for temporary legal status for undocumented immigrants who have been in the country for 5 years or more. The bill has been led by Representative Maria Elvira Salazar, Republican of Florida, and Representative Veronica Escobar, Democrat of Texas. Ms. Escobar said that she was hopeful about the legislation and that lawmakers were looking to build a balanced bipartisan coalition. We're not going to add a Democrat until there's a Republican to add, Ms. Escobar said. The reason why I'm hopeful is because there are so many business leaders across the various economic sectors who are sounding the alarm. I hope they will pass on this administration. I hope they will press on the administration. The legislation would also require undocumented immigrants to pay $7,000 in restitution over 7 years and increase penalties for those who cross the border into the country illegally. Texas business owners are eagerly watching to see whether the measure garners more bipartisan support. The proposed legislation has met some opposition, especially from Republicans, who have said that it is effectively an amnesty bill. Restaurant owners have said that they believe Republican lawmakers may be unwilling to support such efforts amid the Trump administration's immigration crackdown, while Democrats lack a majority in Congress to advance legislation on permits. We've been saying that the Republicans are going to respond to the economic argument that this hurts small businesses, that this hurts businesses in general, that this is hurting farmers, that this is killing construction, and there's been no movement, Mr. Orman said. I've heard from both sides. Neither is willing to go out on a limb. Mr. Lash, co-founder of Farm to Table, said he understood why Republicans would be a bit fearful to take a stand on work permits, given the perspective that the country should keep more jobs for U.S. citizens. But let's be realistic. It's not as if immigrant labor is coming in and literally getting American citizens fired and kicked off the farms, Mr. Lash said. They're working jobs that people either American citizens don't want or can't perform. People don't understand how physically demanding these jobs are. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, a Republican, did not respond to a request for comment about whether he would support calls for work permits. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, also a Republican, declined to comment. Ms. Erickson Strufert, with the Texas Restaurant Association, said she was aware of the criticism on work permits and the viability of the proposed measure. I have heard that anything short of citizenship is not enough, she said. And then I've heard that at the end of the day, anyone who's here undocumented broke the law, and we shouldn't reward that behavior with a post hoc legal status. Laura Collins, the Director of Immigration Policy at the George W. Bush Institute, a policy organization, said that work permits for immigrants could be a positive incremental reform for now. During his presidency, President George W. Bush called on Congress in 2006 to pass comprehensive immigration reform, including increased border security and a temporary worker program. Despite some bipartisan support, the measure failed to pass through Congress. It might not be a political reality to get a pathway to earned citizenship through Congress right now, Ms. Collins said. Legal work authorization is a good step from a workforce perspective. Kristen Etter, the Director of Policy and Legal Services at the Texas Immigration Law Council, a nonpartisan organization that promotes immigrant rights, said work permits would help bring stability not just for workers, but also for industries that rely on immigrant labor. At a time when many industries are struggling to hire and retain workers, policies that recognize the role immigrants already play in Texas's economy makes practical sense, Ms. Etter said. For now, Mr. Roja, the owner of Revolver Taco Lounge in Dallas, said that he hoped for a boom in business during the World Cup this summer. Arlington, Texas will host more matches than any other city in the United States, and thousands of fans are expected to stay in the Dallas-Fort Worth area during the tournament. We have to start with a positive mindset, Mr. Rojas said. That's what us Texans are like. We don't let ourselves be pushed around. We like a struggle and a fight. We have no other choice. The Shock of Learning You Knew a Serial Killer by Ginia Belafonte. One July morning in 2023, I was driving my son to an art class when my friend Amy Ryan called with news that seems destined never to lose its shock value. The Gilgo Beach serial killer, who had murdered young women, all sex workers, over decades, leaving their bodies wrapped in burlap in the brush along the Atlantic Ocean on Long Island, had just been identified and taken into custody. "You will not believe who it is," she reported in whispered astonishment. "It's Rex Heuermann," a disclosure that had me pull over. However unlikely it was that the two of us, lifelong New Yorkers in middle age, one a journalist, the other an Oscar and Tony-nominated actress, would know a serial killer merely by way of our domestic routines, it is in fact where we had landed. Heuermann was a consulting architect who worked with the stewards of several well-kept pre-war apartment buildings in Brooklyn, brought in to sign off on individual renovations or advise on broader structural projects. I dealt with him briefly over the reconstruction of a courtyard garden when I served on my co-op board in Brooklyn Heights. With other board members, I sat in occasional basement meetings with him, talking about, as I vaguely recall, things like drainage efficiency. But Amy's contact had been closer. Heuermann had been in her apartment, arguing with her architect about window measurements. That would have been chillingly bizarre enough on its own, but there was another, even more startling connection. Long before Heuermann had fallen on the radar of Long Island law enforcement, Amy starred in Lost Girls, the 2020 Netflix film about the families of the Gilgo Beach victims, which was based on Robert Kolker's book of the same name. In it, she plays Mary Gilbert, the mother of Shannon Gilbert, whose remains were found in the bramble at Oak Beach, a few miles from Gilgo, an eerie part of the Long Island coastline, roughly halfway between the sociologically diverse Rockaways and the private equity funhouse of the Hamptons. By 2011, 7 other bodies, or parts of bodies, were found in the area. After nearly 12 years of mostly fruitless investigations, detectives finally arrested Heuermann. He had been scheduled to go to trial this fall for 7 counts of murder, having entered a plea of not guilty despite the mountain of evidence against him. But on April 8th, during an ordinary hearing in a Suffolk County courtroom, he reversed himself, pleaded guilty on all counts, and admitted to killing an 8th woman, a case in which he had not faced charges. Over the course of 20 minutes, asked how he had entered the lives of each of his victims, he methodically answered strangulation in every instance. The addiction to serial killer narratives has a long history in modern American life, but Heuermann's apprehension landed in the news at a particular moment when prestige true crime had become ascendant, when art turned more aggressively to the truths of lurid violence and ambiguous resolutions. The Jinx, the acclaimed 2015 6-part documentary on HBO, might have signaled a turning point. The film ends, as viewers surely remember, with its subject, the real estate heir and suspected serial killer Robert Durst, seemingly confessing to 3 murders on a hot mic while he is in the bathroom. Killed them, all of them, he says, in the middle of urinating. A decade before, the French documentary The Staircase, about a North Carolinian novelist who may or may not have killed both his wives, primed a generation. It inspired the producers of the groundbreaking podcast Serial. Over the past several years, the Gilgo Beach murders have generated several podcasts, endless coverage in the news media, countless Reddit threads, and in addition to Lost Girls, a multi-part documentary, Gone Girls, by the same director, Liz Garbus. That second effort, she told me, was driven by the opportunity to look at what was going on inside the Suffolk County Police Department. From the perspective of content creation, the Gilgo Beach story had the advantage of many layered parts and intoxicating sidebars, and the corruption and disarray within the world of local law enforcement was one of them. It had slowed an investigation that ultimately ended with pyrotechnic forensic work and the efficient interventions of the FBI. If the break in the case seemed cinematic, involving the retrieval of a discarded pizza box in Midtown Manhattan, successfully mined for traces of DNA, the killer himself was not. Hulking and overweight with period drama hair from no discernible period, Heuermann could not rely on charm and good looks to lure his victims the way that Ted Bundy did. He was not in a position of authority like the Golden State Killer, a cop who terrorized women up and down California for years. Nor was he like Gerard John Schaefer, a former policeman who abducted hitchhikers in Florida in the 1970s. He was not a schizophrenic like Ed Gein, whose story was fictionalized in the 1959 Robert Bloch novel Psycho, the precursor to the Hitchcock film. Gein later served as the character sketch for the deranged Buffalo Bill in Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs. Heuermann's mark of distinction was that he was a workaday architect operating without prestige. He lived in Massapequa Park and commuted to his office in Manhattan on the Long Island Railroad. He killed poor women at night when his wife was out of town and tangled with privileged New Yorkers all day long, sometimes imperiously denying them the upgrades they were after. Rex Heuermann is why I don't have central air, as a wealthy co-op owner living at a prestigious Brooklyn address put it to me 3 years ago, just after the arrest. One reaction to the arc of the Gilgo Beach murders might be to say that it seems straight out of David Lynch, the horrors of suburbia lurking beneath that top coat of civility and tidiness. Except that the veneer in this case was barely applied. Heuermann lived in the tiny house where he had grown up. It was dilapidated and he had tax liens. He kept a stash of guns inside and would swing an axe in the front yard. His neighbors found him unpleasant at best, menacing at worst. Parents warned their children to avoid his house on Halloween. In the city, he merely seemed obstructionist, until he was identified as a barbaric criminal, at which point he emerged as something of a novelty, a serial killer in a place where serial killing had not been localized since The Son of Sam in the 1970s. For a while, I could hardly let a dinner party pass without telling parts of this story, a story whose point, as I had conceived it, was that I knew a serial killer, as if this ought to have been a line item on a resume. Invariably, everyone at the table would gasp in a way that suggested they were also entertained. This is because the story was always told in neighborhoods where the most intimate connection the majority of people would ever have had to criminal activity was playing pickleball with the guy around the corner who just went down for insider trading. The real point, of course, is something else entirely. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 19th issue of the front select section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Kathy. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 716-821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. A Braille version of the schedule is also available upon request. Our number again is 716-821-5555. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability